Hello and welcome to this Arts and Humanities Society lecture. I'm Dr. Stuart Mitchell and I'm going to talk to you today about Georgian Townscapes, fashion, style and rivalry. The chronology I'm going to take is roughly from the 1720s through to the 1820s. The latter period allows me to bring in what is generally known as the Regency period of architecture, and also rather slyly allows me to slip my own hometown Brighton into what I'm going to talk about. Although I'm going to talk about Georgian architecture in general, I will be concentrating on towns, and that's going to be mostly in England and Scotland. Of course, there are lots of fine Georgian country houses and the such like. That's not going to be the main focus here, and nor will I just be speaking about buildings, but of the broader changes to the public space in the period that I'm covering. Now, when most people imagine Georgian towns, they probably think of elegant buildings like these ones here. We have on the left-hand side of the slide, that's near where I live. This is Brunswick Square in Hove, which is created in the 1820s, so right at the end of our period today. And then on the right-hand side of the slide, something from a whole century earlier. This is Queen Square in Bath. It's one of the first of the Georgian type architectural formations in the 18th century. And below that, this is more of a kind of a public facility, the Royal Pump Room at Leamington Spa. That's created in 1814. So there's, as you can see, similarities in the style of architecture between the three photographs there, and there's plenty to admire. But we have to, as historians, remember a few things when we're seeking to interpret these sources. And the first is what we're looking at here is something like the finished product. These things took time to build. They're built at different times. They're often built out of different materials, and often they're surrounded by more vernacular styles and buildings. Now, I'm going to use that term vernacular from time to time in what follows. And by it, I mean buildings that were constructed out of local materials in often local styles, and not necessarily adhering to a specific artistic aesthetic in the same way as the three examples there all adhere to roughly the same kind of aesthetic. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as the slides go on. So we have to remember that vernacular architecture is still around, and the cases in which you get a Georgian townscape, a Georgian development which is completely constructed on virgin ground, are pretty rare, certainly to large scale things. There's one major exception, and that's the Edinburgh New Town, and I'm going to talk about that in a few slides time. Now, I'm going to be referring mostly to the elements of towns that were built in the Georgian period. We need to remember that they may have been contested at the time, are not necessarily always welcome in the facilities where they were built, and even when they were complete, they didn't look exactly necessarily as they do today. So, well, for example, the Brunswick Square photograph there, that's not the color. That kind of custody color is not the color that Brunswick Square was originally when it was built. It was a much darker, almost brickish kind of color when it was finished. So when I'm talking about townscapes, I'm also referring to the process by which they came together, as well as the finished product. I hope that will become a little bit clearer as the presentation goes on. But before I say any more about the specific buildings and the specific layouts of towns, we need a little bit of context for the developments that I'm going to speak about, and that's what I'm going to do on the next slide. So what we need to understand is that we're probably quite used to thinking about the 19th century as the one in which there is a massive explosion in urbanization. But in fact, actually, the 18th century is almost as dramatic as the 19th century in terms of increasing urbanization. So urban growth is considerable in the 18th century. And that's manifested both in a rising population within towns and also increasing number of towns that have 10,000 or more inhabitants. And that's at the beginning of the 18th century. There are, other than London, there are 5 towns in Britain which have more than 10,000 inhabitants. By the end of the 18th century, there are 27, and more are added after that as well. So that urbanization it sort of proceeds on 2 fronts, if you like. And of course, people tended to live cheek by jowl in towns, so the fashions and the cultural behaviours that they adopted tended to spread more quickly than in agrarian areas. Much of that change is led by London. That's partly because of the Great Fire of London in 1666, which raises something like 85% of the buildings in the city. So there's a massive program of redevelopment and rebuilding in London after the Great Fire, and that dynamism kind of feeds outwards from London and is copied elsewhere in the country. Likewise, we need to be bear in mind the economics of town development. Now, again, in the 19th century, that's often associated with industry, the growth of industry. In the 18th century, however, it's less associated with that, although it is a little towards the end. But it's the rise of a mass services sector that is the most important development in 18th century Britain, and that is what creates essentially the money, the funds, to be able to do this redevelopment and this rebuilding, which we associate with Georgian townscapes, and to a lesser extent overseas commerce as well, expanding trade, especially in ports. That's Bristol and Liverpool and Southampton and that sort of thing. That rising tide of commerce also provides a lot of the money and the impetus for the refashioning of towns. Now, as a kind of a subcategory of the services sector, it's leisure, in particular, leisure facilities that become increasingly central to urban life, and you get the appearance of what you will call the spa town, or perhaps the leisure town phenomenon. That is a town that is essentially constructed or expanded to afford a leisure experience to its patrons, to the extent that in the first half of the 18th century, you see the creation of 34 new spa towns in England alone, and more still in Wales and Scotland and Ireland as well. And the spa towns promote an idea of orderly leisure, and that orderliness is important. And again, it's one of the several ideas which kind of inform the development of Georgian towns, the way they look and the way they feel to their inhabitants and to their visitors. I'll come back to that later. Urban culture is likewise increasingly that of the literate and well-informed, and that's partly because of the explosion in print, in publishing. This tends to, or it seems to originate round about the 1690s. Um, what happens in the 1690s is there's the lapsing of what is called the licensing order. So that's the licensing of printed material, which was essentially a form of state censorship. That's gone by the beginning of the 18th century, and you get, in consequence, or at least in partly in consequence, an explosion, a mushrooming of the number of different types of publications that are available for people to buy. There's also a greater kind of politicization of urban life and spaces. Now, I don't mean that in the sense of the kind of 20th, 21st century idea of party politics, but nonetheless, there are issues around religious faith, for example, or foreign policy, or issues of local importance that become dividing lines and become issues that divide people on a local basis as well as kind of nationally. And there's more discussion about these things because there are venues, there are arenas in which these things can happen, like coffee houses and assembly rooms and the such like. And then above all, the importance here that's of the middling sort. Now, I'm going to sometimes refer to the middling sort as the middle class. That's actually anachronistic for the 18th century, but it's a useful shorthand. It's those groups of people who are not part of the older landed elites, and neither are they part of the working groups in the population, the labouring classes. But their number increases quite dramatically during the 18th century, and they are driving an idea of the polite society. And that idea of politeness, which has a number of different facets, which I'm going to explain on the later slides, has an enormous impact in the way that Georgian towns start to look, and the types of buildings that are constructed, and the type of infrastructure as well that is being built. So I'm going to go on and explain why those two things in tandem are so important on this slide here. Polite society and the middling sort. Here we've got two quotes from two of the most important historians of 18th century urban development, Peter Borsay at the top there, Lawrence Klein beneath him. And in the first quote there, Borsay is explaining why there is this rise in what we call the middling sort, which becomes the middle class over time, although that term isn't used in the 18th century. And one of the reasons why there is this emergence of this middling sort is that they are grow on the back of expanding state with need for the types of services provided by lawyers, attorneys, doctors, surgeons. He mentions there, and a rise in the numbers of civil servants as well that are needed to administer overseas entanglements, the French wars that he mentions there under William III. So this is why their numbers are increasing, and they are instrumental in creating a new type of ethos, urban ethos and culture. And it's that new culture that is kind of explained in what's below, the quote from Klein here. They wanted ideas of appropriateness. They wanted, in part, to kind of ape the quality. That's a phrase that is quite common in the 18th century. But they also wanted a kind of a cultural palette and a means by which they could demonstrate that they had the necessary tastes and the necessary manners that would show them to be kind of the equal of their supposed social betters, which is generally speaking the landed elites. I hope that makes some kind of sense. So this is what develops into politeness. And politeness, Lawrence Klein explains there, is essentially an aesthetic standard for lots of different kinds of human artifacts and products, and indeed behaviours as well. So, because society and culture can be polite in various ways. Lawrence Klein gives you some examples there: polite age, polite nation, polite people. And what that draws on, that notion of politeness, is the exemplars of classical civilizations, which were assumed to be the politest ages, these spells of Hellenic and Roman creativity, as Klein puts it there. Now, the practical manifestation of that politeness, as it's seen in towns, is the development, first of all, of that print culture that I was talking about. So the widely circulating journals and newspapers which reinforce those ideas of politeness, and also in physical terms, how streets and buildings and the layout of towns, how that actually looks in practice as well. So I'm going to go on and discuss those two things. The first thing to say is that print culture, as I've already said, kind of absolutely saturates polite society. This is an example from the London Magazine of 1778. And those motifs, if you like, of classical civilizations, you can see those reproduced in a highly stylized form on the left-hand side of the frontispiece of the book, journal. So we have Hermes. Hermes is delivering dispatches to this seated Roman or possibly Greek sage, who is supposed to represent the London Magazine itself. And around these two figures, you can see some of the emblems, the images that are associated with classical architecture. On the contents page, we see something else that's kind of, I think, often seen as a bit odd or unusual, and that is there is an intense sense of competition in polite society, and that quite often reveals itself in some really quite dramatic boasting about the how good a particular product is, whether that is, as here, a polite journal, or whether that's in a building, as we're going to see on the next slide. That surprises a lot of people when they come across that polite society is also quite a boastful society, because one has to really press one's claims to being polite and tasteful in all things. So here the phrase below the opening few lines here is that the London Magazine is a work far superior to every old monthly publication of the kind hitherto published or now publishing. So it's a really a case of we are the best. And most journals kind of follow that type of language, that type of pattern in the way in which they present themselves. So polite culture is not restrained. Um, uh, in fact, it seeks to openly and ostentatiously display its elegance, its refinements, its superior taste. There's another example a little lower down the page. In the centre there, probably not very clear to you because that's quite small type. There's a list of the different things that are in that magazine, all of which are in one way or another archetypes or emblems of politeness, such as history, politics, biography, philosophy, fashion, and so forth, and science too. Um, but a little bit lower down the page, there's this phrase here that I'm pointing to there, that this journal is embellished with the greatest variety of elegant, superb, and numerous copper plates executed with superior excellence by the very best artists in London, being absolutely of themselves worth considerably more than 4 times the price of the whole work. That is, so it's worth, these plates alone, these illustrations alone are worth 4 times the price of the journal as a whole. That's how good value it is to you, polite denizen of wherever you might live. So here's another example. And as I say, being polite doesn't mean being humble. It often means passing judgment. It means having an opinion on what is good and beautiful and artistically pleasing, and that obviously includes buildings. And by it's got kind of a deliberate contrast with what has gone before, which is often seen as sort of vulgar and low and uncivil. So you'll see if you look through the periodical press in the 18th century, lots of examples like this, in which certain buildings and other forms of artistic expression are venerated and others are kind of looked down upon. This is a piece from the Ladies' Magazine, which is, if anything, more important than the London Magazine in terms of its impact on polite culture. Published in the late 18th century and on into the 19th, covering most of the latter part of the period that I'm talking about here. This is from 1792, and it's a description with an accompanying plate of the Parliament House in Dublin. And just have a look at this kind of language. So again, the kind of the boasting, the ostentation is there. The expense of this building was £40,000, which was a pretty considerable sum at the beginning of the 18th century. And the structure was deserving of the greatest praise. It has not yet been exceeded, and it was justly accounted as one of the first productions of modern architecture. And Georgian print culture was not shy, and Georgian people were not shy of talking about things as modern, and modern is seen to be good in comparison to what has gone before in the 16th and 17th century, as seen as a kind of an unfortunate parenthesis in human development. Likewise, there's a discussion here about the individual elements of the building as well. The portico was perhaps without a parallel. The portico, you can see that in the centre of the plate there. It was of the Ionic order. you may be familiar with the different orders of architecture in classical Greece and Rome. There are three in ancient Greece. There's arguably a fourth rather, added in the Roman period. The most important ones are Ionic, Doric, and Corinthian, and you can usually tell which is which by looking at the capitals at the top of individual pillars. So this is of the Ionic order there, and that's a good thing, tick. It is finished with a balustrade with proper figures thereon, and it would have done honour to ancient Rome in the Augustan age. So again, this harking back, this reference to the polite ages of classical civilization. You can see there's a quote there from Gilbert Stettler beneath the plate itself, which is quite important because it encapsulates how these polite ideas fed through into physical construction of buildings and indeed of towns as a whole. Buildings need to embody the principles of classical proportion, rationality, harmony, and measure. And within this classicism was a close relationship between notions of what was beautiful aesthetically and what was good in terms of the organization of society. So the classical ideal assumes a world controllable by humans, and one product was planning the form of urban places rather than merely allowing them to evolve spontaneously, as in the medieval period. And this is the period that's being looked at, or one of the periods that's being looked down upon by the great enlightened of the 18th century. And that fashion could be directly translated into the style of architecture and the spatial organization of society through town planning. I'm going to come back to that in a slide or two's time. But for now, let's have a quick look at some of the types of buildings that conform to that idea of neo-classical beauty and moral worth as well, if you like. So there on the left-hand side of the slide, you see the Church of St Andrews in the Square in Glasgow, and that conforms to a lot of the imagery that is closely associated with the neoclassicism. That's created in 1739. In the centre, we have the Ratcliffe camera, which is built across the 1730s and 40s. It's now part of the Bodleian Library, probably the most important Neo-Palladium building in Oxford. When I say Neo-Palladium, that's kind of a synonym for neoclassicist. It's after the architect Palladio. And this is, as I say, it's built in the 1730s and 40s, and it's constructed to hold the science library of the university. So not only is it striking as a piece of architecture, it's a building that fits very neatly with the ideas of the polite urban environment that I've just been discussing. So its style clearly is fashionable at the time, but its function too, holding that science library, is testament to the influence of the rational, ordered mindset that is so important to the middle classes' ideational world in the Georgian period. So that's a typical, well, it's a particularly fine exemplar, but it's a typical example of the type of architecture that you will see that's associated with this Hanoverian period. But it's not just places like Oxford and Glasgow, large cities that already have very important kind of civic functions and a certain cachet, but also rising towns which are more usually associated with industrial development to start, certainly from the middle onwards of the 18th century, start to adopt some of these forms of architecture to kind of like to emulate towns around them, and to show that they are just as good. They're just as good as other centres of urban development. And we see this not only in the obvious places like Leamington Spa and Tunbridge Wells and so forth, but also in industrial towns like Leeds here, or Norwich and Bristol and Birmingham and so forth. They're all starting to develop um, as centres of fashionable culture, and they start to provide assembly rooms and classical squares, theatrical facilities, um, public gardens, all those things that are closely associated with the display of polite values. The assembly rooms here are part of the White Cloth Hall in Leeds, and what you can see at the top there, that's how it looks roughly today in the photograph. That double-storied building there is this on the plan beneath it, and you can see behind that the assembly room part of the structure. There is a large quadrangle. That's the market, in which cloth was purchased, exchanged, and bartered in various ways. Okay. Oh, just before we move on, I should point out, you'll see here the kind of the preponderance of stone in the construction of these buildings. A lot of that is a consequence not simply of the fashionable trend towards classicism, and of course stonework lends itself more naturally towards the types of styles preferred in classical architecture, but it's also a practical, almost a health and safety thing, because after the Great Fire of London, which destroys something in the region of 13,000 houses and 87 churches in London, there's a move away from traditional building materials. So in London at the time of the fire, buildings were, on the whole, they were timber framed, and they were often thatched rather than tiled for their roofing. And clearly wood and straw burn a lot more easily than stone and brick and tiles. So in the period after the fire, not only is London reconstructing itself at quite a manic pace, but also the styles that are adopted there, which are then kind of mimicked and adopted by towns in the provinces, have a much greater preponderance of non-flammable materials there. So stone and brick and tile and so forth they're in where older building materials are very definitely out post 1666, and you'll see that throughout the 18th century. Moreover, it also lends itself to a different type of layout of towns. The roads are made on the whole a lot wider and a lot broader. There's more space between buildings on the whole in London as it's being reconstructed. And again, those are kind of safety measures. Um, and they just also happen to be kind of more elegant and more pleasing to the eye, at least to the Georgians. And so they tend to be adopted elsewhere. And we'll see a very practical example of that in a slide or two's time. of course, it's all it's very easy to look at the individual buildings, but that doesn't reveal the process. And as I said a slide or two back, this is a talk that's, as I hope, as much about the process of the construction of townscapes as it is about the individual buildings within them. And of course, if new buildings and new facilities are being created, they need to be planned and they need to be funded in one way or another. Now, obviously, if you're an individual householder, you can initiate and you can pay for alterations either to the facade or to the internal spaces of your house in order to make that more of a showcase for your taste, your manners, your politeness. But for much bigger projects, other kinds of sources of funding and other kind of legitimate planning mechanisms were necessary. And so there's a whole cluster of different interested parties, so to speak. They're not mutually exclusive, but a cluster of different parties who help with or encourage the development of the types of townscapes that I've been talking about. The national state, the central state in London, certainly post 1707, is not really one of them, except insofar as the central state is there to provide a kind of a framework within which legislation can be passed, which allows this type of development to go ahead. But it doesn't really contribute very much in terms of funding, not directly. Much more important is local authorities, town corporations. They provide much of the legislative planning that allows these developments to go ahead, or they can petition Parliament if it's a particularly important development to allow for the passage of private bills for certain things to be erected, whether that's, let's say, a bathhouse or street lighting or something of that nature. And they sponsor, too, these local authorities and corporations, they sponsor the individual initiatives, of which what you're seeing on the page is the results of one of these initiatives, which allow the types of building that we've already observed to go ahead. So in Edinburgh, this is the result of a competition that is run by the local town authorities to design the new town. And the new town is on the north of the valley that sits in the kind of the central part of Edinburgh. You'll see it a bit more clearly on the next slide. And this is the winning design for the new town from James Craig. And now initially Craig wanted this to be laid out, the streets to be laid out like the Union flag, but that was ultimately dismissed as being a little bit too difficult to execute and a bit too fanciful. But he's still nonetheless kept a lot of stuff in his plan, which is redolent of the importance of the Hanoverian monarchy and the Act of Union. So you see here at the far west side of the town, that's St George's Square, and facing it at the other end of the new town is St Andrew's Square. So again, that's a reference to the importance of the entwining of the two nations. There's a kind of a homage paid to the monarchy in the big, broad, polite street that links the two. That's called George Street. there. So those things are named after the royal family, and the whole pattern is blocks and cruciform designs, as you can see, that link one block to the next. What's interesting here is you start to see, remember the quote from Steltler, you start to see the beginning of urban zoning in the planning of towns. Edinburgh is unusual in the respect that it had a lot of land to the north and it all could be developed. Most towns don't have that luxury, but where they do, there's quite often a form of zoning that is being applied to the construction of new towns. So you see the big elegant squares, of course, at either end, and you see the big broad shopping and leisure street, George Street, that cuts through the middle of the new town. Also to the north and south, there's Queen Street and Princes Street, which have similar kinds of functions. And that's where the polite, the old elites, the old landed elites, and the relatively new rising middle class elites, that's where they would be seen. That was their arena of display, if you like. But there are also rather cunningly running between the blocks, and these are long, very narrow streets which cut through the centre of each block. To the north, that's Thistle Street. To the south, that's Rose Street. Again, references to the civic bond between Scotland and England. But those little narrow streets contain lots of little manufacturing workshops and retail spaces and places where labouring people worked, and they provided the kind of the motor of the service economy that kept the big, well-heeled, polite houses running. So the servants of the quality who had inhabited the houses in the larger, more elegant streets often lived in these two narrow streets at the back there, and that's also where they would have gone to do their shopping, the shopping that keeps the domestic household running. Of course, the polite middling sort and landed gentry did shop, but they didn't shop for the nuts and bolts of life. They only shopped for very dramatic and elegant things, which might be, dresses or artwork or jewelry or something like that. That's perfectly legitimate. Those shops, those big showpiece shops, where one can be seen, are on the display streets. There are George Street and Princes Street, but the everyday shops that are selling things like meat and vegetable and tools and cutlery and cloth and all those sorts of things are there in those little narrow streets that run behind the outward-facing blocks there, the Thistle Street and Rose Street. So that's an early example of what we would now call zoning within the a planned town development. You can see how that's developed in this second map, which is in 1836, so not even a full century after the Craig's plan is approved by the town authorities, and you can see how much this has developed. So at the core, in the centre of the map, that's the original new town, and you can still see St George's Square, St Andrew's Square, and so forth, and the kind of straight line cruciform pattern there, but it's obviously mushroomed out beyond its original confines, and you can see that it's moving northwards there down towards the Firth, and you've got areas here. Anything that has a black line, a filled-in black line around one of the blocks, that's housing or well, building that's been completed. So you can see that there's quite a lot of development even by 1836, and those around here. This is up in the northeastern corner, and down in the southwest to some extent as well. Those areas which have the kind of fainter outline, that's housing that's been planned but hasn't yet been finished. So you can see this is still developing in the same kind of way as that Craig designed right at the centre there. What's also worth noting here is the kind of juxtaposition between the old town and the new. I'm pointing to the old town there, and you can see the difference there. The new town is essentially constructed in kind of direct contrast to the old town. The buildings in the old town, which stretches along the Royal Mile, that's that central band running across the from east to west, and sitting on the opposite side of the valley to the new town. Those buildings are much more tightly clustered together, much more vernacular. The roads are kind of a bit higgledy-piggledy. Most of these things are still there. If you visit Edinburgh, if you live in Edinburgh, then you'll know this, and that's quite dramatically different to the Craig vision of the new town there. And of course the new town is an attempt to get away from the old vulgar vernacular old town type evolutionary development, and a move towards planning. Just before we move to the next slide, I should also point out this is the view down George Street, which is the kind of the central polite shopping street or leisure street in the new town when it's first built, and you can see there the typical 18th century architecture, the church, the statue, the broadness of the road is indicative or archetypal of what a new Georgian town looked like. Okay. Now I've been talking about the kind of sources of planning and funding. Another thing that's important is voluntary associations. Voluntary associations very often provide funds directly for projects, or they organise public petitions or subscriptions. Subscriptions are an extremely important source of funds, particularly when they are devoted towards creating public amenities like hospitals, libraries, public gardens, memorials, street paving, all that sort of thing. And these are, as I say, tend to be organised by voluntary associations. Sometimes those voluntary associations are a little bit more like guilds, the medieval guilds. I'll give you an example, actually, if I flick back a few slides here to the Leeds Assembly Rooms. The Leeds Assembly Rooms in the old white cloth hall there, that bit of it, the double-storied edge of the square, that's almost entirely funded by the local cloth merchant associations. So they've operated really a little bit like the medieval guilds there, and providing the funds for this kind of one-off development. But voluntary associations could also take the form of what I'm going to show you here, which is a kind of state encouraged, but not necessarily state funded, in fact very rarely state funded societies like the British Fisheries Society. Or when it was first created, it was called the British Society for Extending the Fisheries and Improving the Sea Coast of this Kingdom. Now, that was set up in the 1780s by a group of Scottish landowners, and also incorporated as a joint stock company. And that raised funds for the redevelopment of four initially fishing villages and fishing towns which had kind of fallen into decay in the two of them in the Hebrides, and two on the north coast of Scotland. And they provided money to redevelop these towns, and they redeveloped them in what is obviously a very typically neoclassicist, polite type of way, even though these are relatively small settlements. On the left-hand side there, you can see Thomas Telford, one of the architects involved, his plan for Loch Bay on the Isle of Skye from the 1790s, and similar to the Craig plan for the new town in Edinburgh, you can see the cruciform design there, the straight lines and the regular curves. You could have curves, but as long as they were kind of in proportion. And once again, a very kind of rudimentary kind of zoning of the town was envisaged by Telford there. Likewise, on the right hand side there, this is a design for the Harbourfront Inn at another of the fishing towns that were redeveloped. Tobermory, this is from 1788, and obviously the neoclassicist imprint is fairly observable there. This is, of course, a little more Spartan than most Georgian residences and most Georgian buildings, but nonetheless, the look of it is typically kind of neoclassicist, and there is some ornamentation here in the two pillars to either side, which again is kind of typically a neoclassicist type of architecture. So that's an example of a voluntary association that is kind of self-starting and rolls out or develops the Georgian townscape in very specific areas, and so that kind of replicates what we've seen in the case of Edinburgh on a very much smaller scale. There are another couple of sources of funding. So here we can see two pictures, a print of Brunswick Square, which we saw on one of the very first slides from when it was first constructed in the 1830s. And we also have an aerial photograph of Georgian Bath. These are developments that are essentially driven by entrepreneurs and architects. The prestige of living in new purpose-built housing, so there's these kind of great squares and crescents and so forth, meant that to build them in towns which hitherto hadn't acquired them was actually quite a profitable undertaking, and they often incorporated leisure facilities within them as well. So you get bathing houses, let's say, or theatres or markets and the such like. And the impetus for this comes from individual architects and entrepreneurs who see an opportunity and engage in speculative building, so to speak, to erect these developments. And they raise money for that, partly through issuing shares in a particular enterprise, and especially from people who buy the houses before they're constructed, or at least before they're finished, Nowadays we call this buying off plan, but this is exactly the same kind of concept in the 18th century. So in Brunswick Square, that's created, almost entirely designed and created by an architect called Charles Busby, and Georgian Bath, or at least most of Georgian Bath, is created by a father and son team, so to speak. John Wood the elder and John Wood the younger, and the the older of the two. Where the orange dot is, that's where Queen Square is, down there. That's what we saw on the second slide. And from that point, which is one of the first Georgian developments, there's a kind of movement outwards from that core to develop the other kind of quite famous parts of Georgian Bath. So that's the circus there, and that's the Royal Crescent. And these are designed and sold really as speculative building projects by John Wood the elder, and then later his son. You can also see, I'm sure, the similarity there between the layout, which is, you know, typically ordered and harmonious and neoclassical in inspiration, and what we saw earlier with Edinburgh and even the fishing villages as well. Likewise, the Brunswick Square has a similar kind of pattern here, and you can see the zoning as well. This is the large elegant square where most of the residences are, and this is what fronts the development, and it's what abuts the promenade, you can see below it. But behind the magnificent square, in these two little enclaves either side, which is kind of tucked away behind the showpiece frontage, are all the smaller streets in which the servants of the landed and rich middling groups lived. And likewise, that's where you get things like stabling. There's a market in those back streets, and various other kinds of mechanics, of which allow the central area to be maintained as this kind of showcase for the well-heeled. Okay, now there's one further form of funding which is quite often overlooked, and that's a much older type of patronage, which is given by the traditional elites, landed elites, aristocracy, even the crown from time to time. And a lot of those longer standing forms of aristocratic patronage remain significant throughout the Hanoverian period. One of the best examples of that is here, the Radcliffe Camera. The Radcliffe Camera is not built by public subscription or anything like that. It's built with funds from, or a bequest from John Radcliffe himself. So obviously he's not around to see it being constructed, but he was the court physician to William III and Queen Mary, and so it's his money that pays for that construction. And there are numerous examples of that kind of financing for public facilities, leisure activities, and the such like throughout the 18th century. So although an awful lot of money does come from the rising middling sort in its various forms, or from town corporations from time to time in a more limited way, it remains the case that there is still a fair amount of kind of aristocratic patronage that's still involved in the creation of these. Now, just one last caveat I think I need to add here, and which I've alluded to several times already, and that is the persistence of the vernacular, because it's not the case that towns are kind of like radically transformed overnight, or even over the 100 or so years that I've been looking at in this presentation. And most places, most towns, and particularly smaller towns, market towns and the such like, throughout the British Isles, retain an awful lot of architecture that predates the Georgian period, even by the early 19th century. And generally speaking, so you see patterns of development which are more like, for example, a single street, let's say, or a small block that's developed in that typically polite style of Georgian street architecture. But most places, the polite, elegant types of buildings are slotted in where they can, alongside much older vernacular architecture. I'll give you these two examples from, this is a town where I spent most of my childhood, which is in Berkshire. And you can see on the left-hand picture there, the rather elegant Georgian building which housed a bank. Again, so that's another example of the services sector. And then going off from that into the distance, most of that property is Georgian or Victorian. But right next door to it, this is okay. It's gone through a lot of changes since the time at which, or the time to which I'm referring. But that's a 16th century construction, and you can see it looks quite different, to, even with the alterations, to what surrounds it, and that is still there in the when this photograph is taken, which is I think in the early 1960s. It's gone now. It's been replaced by some ghastly 1980s carbuncle, but it sits alongside. So the Georgian architecture doesn't necessarily replace what's there already. It doesn't replace the vernacular, but it's kind of like fitted in where it can around it. Likewise, in the picture on the right-hand side of the slide there, you can see very obviously there's that lovely elegant Georgian townhouse right at the bottom of the street. So that's very clearly an 18th century construction. Likewise, these houses here are Georgian, but right next door to it there's this, which I think nowadays we'd say, well, lovely, well-preserved Tudor building, which it is a lovely, well-preserved Tudor building. But that's at the time, this is probably likely to have been quite dilapidated and tumbling down, and it's only kind of like years of restoration that make it look as appealing as it does now. At the time, it's more likely to have been seen as a kind of an eyesore, a bit of an impediment. Again, this is early 16th century, the building there. So that coexists alongside the Georgian architecture. So it's not really the case. Your Brunswick towns and Edinburgh New Towns and all those sort of things, where essentially the whole of a previous set of development either doesn't exist or is cleared away, and everything is essentially brand new and quote unquote modern. That's quite a rarity to see those types of developments. Instead, what you generally get is this kind of patchwork effect in which Georgian building is alongside, juxtaposed or slotted in amongst older kind of vernacular styles of architecture. Now, I've talked about the importance of London kind of leading the way in some of these developments, but towns, especially as the 18th century goes on, are not just mimicking London, but they're also seeking to emulate and indeed outdo one another. Historians are a bit divided on whether that was essentially a competitive spirit or a cooperative one, but we've seen the examples of the kind of the boasting in the London magazine, Ladies magazine, which suggests to me that there is a certain acidness about the about some of this interaction between towns. Now. That rivalry spills over into a culture of urban improvement, which becomes incredibly competitive. One of the things it's manifested in is travelogues. Travelogues and travel writing becomes incredibly popular in the 18th century. It tends to be published either as books or as articles in the kind of polite periodical press that I showed you earlier on. And increasingly, what town authorities fear the most is a bad review in one kind or another. If your town is pointed out by a travel writer to be in some way kind of uncivil or vulgar or vernacular or parochial, then that's considered to be a very bad thing because you're constantly in competition with one another. So you get a kind of a glut of guides and accounts and descriptions of provincial towns, certainly from kind of the third or fourth decade of the 18th century onwards, in which there is this kind of unspoken, between the lines reading of the writing itself, in which different towns are trying to show off their best parts and downplay their less salubrious features. That's a very early example there in the centre from Daniel Defoe. Of course, Daniel Defoe famously did a tour of the whole of Great Britain and wrote it up in a series of articles and books. This is from 1727, and he talked about the decay of Dunfermline and the various buildings that are kind of like toppling down and rotting away. So this is an example of a bad review. This is what most towns were seeking desperately to avoid in their provision of a better, more improved urban environment. And the kind of solution to that was to move towards something that approximated that more rational, ordered, aesthetically pleasing neoclassicist town planning that we've seen on the previous slides. Now, generally speaking, the competition and emulation reveals itself in a variety of ways, and kind of spurs on the urban reconfigurations. It comes in three different forms. First of all, there's the almost ubiquitous writing about one's own town, in which it's stressed how great your town is. And you've got an example of that from the Scots magazine there in 1769, the opening of the Theatre Royal in Edinburgh, part of the new town development. It may, with justice, be said to be one of the neatest and most elegant theatres in Europe. Mr. Ross has given us the most superbly modern building in the kingdom, which does honour to the country and to his talents. It was opened with the following prologue. The prologue itself, the article goes on to actually quote the prologue at quite some length, and it's full of the kind of overblown imagery of the great sort of Greek and Roman civilizations. Um, this is an example of just ordinary, straightforward boasting about how great your town is. The next level up is in which there's the boasting about the the many attractions in your town, but at the same time, kind of doing down or saying we are unlike some kind of nameless alternatives that may well be local rivals. And we have an example of that on the other side of the slide there, the Lincoln races. Um, this is a broadside ballad, so this is something that's essentially kind of a little piece of street propaganda, if you like. Come nobles and heroes and bucks of the turf, we've had of the dull, smoky town quite enough. The dull, smoky town, of course, is not named here. It could be one of a number of towns in the Lincolnshire vicinity. Or even Nottinghamshire, perhaps. So again, the rivals are not named there, but nonetheless there is a clear distinction drawn, a contrast between Lincoln's marvellous racecourse and its the attractions thereof, against the old uncouth, dull, smoky town. And finally, you get, which is the rarest, but nonetheless it does exist, is where your rivals are named in the kind of print output that's generated. And this is an example in the bottom corner of the slide there from another street ballad. This is Birmingham Lads by John Freeth, a local poet. Lines written to celebrate the Birmingham Canal's opening. And here the target, the rival, is very obviously named, which is Stratford upon Avon. Stratford upon Avon. Mulberry Treasure is a bit unusual. I had to dig around a little to find out what that meant. And it almost certainly refers to the inaugural Shakespeare Festival, which had been initiated by David Garrick, the great kind of actor manager of the mid 18th century, the previous year. Now, in the next line down, it talks of such treasure for once may cause jubilee joys. What that means is essentially it's ephemeral, it's a one-off, whereas day after day, riches spring daily from Birmingham toys. We have something here that is good and permanent and a cause for celebration. Birmingham, of course, was quite famous for its toy manufacturing in the 18th and the 19th century. So this is a reference to one of Birmingham's principal industries there. So you can see there that this is kind of like a multi-layered phenomenon, in which boasting is very common. Boasting about one's town is very common, occasionally with reference to unnamed adversaries, and rarer still, but still from time to time it occurs where a specific local rival is kind of attacked in some way, often in a kind of jocular fashion, but nonetheless the rivalry between different towns is very much real. And so we move to a kind of summary of what I've been talking about. There's more details about the Arts and Humanities Society there on that link at the bottom if you want to check out some of their stuff. Lots of events ongoing, and recordings of previous events like this one also available in their YouTube channel. We now know I hope, that these Georgian townscapes are deeply connected to ideas of politeness. They were stimulated by the growth in print culture, um, periodical press, newspapers, street literature, and so forth, and also travel. A more mobile society creates this flow of information about politeness and about um, the correct form of building and town planning. Um, and that's carried by the middling sort, this growing middle class, if you like. They have rising incomes, and some of that income is diverted into funds for town improvements, and not just buildings, as we've said, but also kind of leisure facilities, um, uh, theatrical events, um, street lighting, parks, memorials, all that kind of thing. And uh, the motifs of that town planning and construction are taste, elegance, rationality, and improvement. Those are the kinds of words that you see kind of almost metronomically repeated in the printed output of the day. But it's very important that not only that one has taste, elegance, and is rational, but also that one displays it. So I've said several times that Georgian polite society is boastful, and it's boastful in a way that is very closely linked to one's social status, improving one's social status. Uh, It's also reflected in the ideas of town planning and zoning, which you simply don't get in the more evolutionary town development of previous centuries. Um, but the idealized Georgian townscape, which we saw with Edinburgh's New Town and with some of the smaller developments like the fishing towns, that was a rarity. More often in an average size market town, you'll get some little patches of polite development alongside older and slightly uncouth forms of vernacular architecture that remain regardless of the best attempts of Georgian society to kind of elbow them out. And it's also driven by imitation of London and imitation of one another, and competition to show which town has the best taste, is the most elegant, has the most commodious facilities for visitors and residents. Okay, well, I hope you've enjoyed that, and by all means go onto the Arts and Humanities Society YouTube channel and see some of the other wonderful lectures that have been put on over the last year or two, and enjoy those too, I hope. Thanks very much.